Let's have a think about what we are going to talk about in our session today. You're probably thinking, what are we going to talk about? Why am I here? What is going to be talked about in this session? We're going to talk about 5 things today. What peer review is, the different forms of peer review, the different forms that it takes, the different styles that different international journals use. And then we're going to talk about how you can manage the peer review process as an author. And then we'll talk about communication skills, how to manage your communications with editors and with peer reviewers. And then lastly, at the end, we'll talk a little bit about how you can perform peer review if you're asked to by a journal. If you haven't seen the great website ReviewerCredits.com, I do encourage you to have a look at that site as well. A lot of what you see, a lot of what you hear in this presentation today comes from information across lots of publishers, lots of experience dealing and managing with peer review. And we'll come back to Reviewer Credits in a little bit, but let's kick off by talking about the peer review process. You've got a paper written, you've selected a target journal, and you've sent your paper in to that target journal, and you are going to then manage the peer review process. It's normal in academic publishing, reputable journals that are SCI listed, Scopus listed, any international journal with a reputation that's listed, that should be the kind of journal that you are choosing for your research papers, will be a peer-reviewed journal. So, what is peer review? The process that academic journals use to judge the quality of academic papers submitted for publication. So, it's a process through which submissions to international journals, manuscript submissions about pieces of research go through before they get published. The process, peer review, is the process that we use to judge the quality of academic papers submitted for publication in scholarly journals. And so, peer-reviewed articles are thought to be reliable because they've gone through this process before publication. We cite peer-reviewed literature in our own research. We use peer-reviewed literature in our own articles, and we want to publish our research in peer-reviewed journals. Thought to be reliable because they've gone through the peer review process before publication. Now, you're probably thinking, peer review, this is something that lots of international journals use. It's been around for ages, but you'd be wrong. Actually, as you can see here, major international journals like Science, Nature, The Lancet didn't start using the peer review process until relatively recently. Science, for example, in the 1940s, Nature didn't start using peer review until the late 1960s, and The Lancet even later. Peer review is actually a relatively recent phenomenon in scholarly publishing, although there are some exceptions. In the 1730s, the Royal Society of Edinburgh published a series of peer-reviewed medical articles, but it's not normal. It wasn't a normal aspect of academic publishing until relatively late. So if you think about papers that were published in the 1950s, before the 1940s, they probably were not peer-reviewed. Academics, researchers could just send their work off to international journals. So, how long have academic journals been using peer review? Not that long, and probably not as long as you might have thought. It's now, however, the basis of all reputable academic publishing, and you should always As we talked about in our first session, when selecting a target journal for your research, select a peer-reviewed journal for your research. That's what your institution wants to see. That's what you will need to do to enhance and develop your career. However, lots of people do find the peer review process to be quite arduous. They find it to be quite an ordeal. And often the feeling that researchers have when they survive the peer review process and they get their papers published is one of extreme relief. Ooh, I got my paper published. I got it through the peer review process. And the process improves content. It improves research content. But when researchers are asked the main function of peer review, they often don't talk about its main function, which of course is to ensure the quality of academic content that gets published in the international literature. Researchers tend to think that peer review is all about their paper, and the function of peer review is to improve their work. That's a byproduct of the peer review process. The main reason for this process is to police, to quality control academic content that gets published in international journals. So what we're all about and what we're going to talk about today is how you can understand the peer review process, how you can use the peer review process to enhance your publishing success and also enhance your career as a researcher. Because if you understand the peer review process better, you can take advantage of the peer review process more effectively. Now, here's a few things that we know about peer review. I know this is a little bit out of date, but there really hasn't been an updated international survey of peer review behavior, all-encompassing global behavior in peer review, since this Publons 2018 report. And this Publons 2018 report showed that about a third of peer reviews done around the world in 2018 were performed in the USA. Of 2.4 editorial invitations that journals sent out to peer reviewers, 1 review was received. So about 2 out of every 3 peer reviewers invited by journals to peer review papers did not accept the invitation. About 70% rejected, mostly because they felt that the paper they were being asked to review was out of scope, or they didn't feel that they had the necessary expertise. And isn't it interesting to notice that this survey also pointed out that reviewers from lower income countries were actually more likely to send their peer reviews back on time? Interesting stuff. Interesting that there's not been an updated survey since 2018. It's actually something that we're working on, but it's difficult for journals to get peer reviews done. And it's also strongly biased, the process, towards researchers based in certain regions. As you can see here, in 2018, about 1/3 of all peer reviews that were done by colleagues in the United States. So perceptions of the process, the peer review process, the process used to judge the quality of academic papers submitted for publication in scholarly journals, can be explained as often a negative experience for authors. And if you've submitted a paper to an international journal and received peer reviews back, perhaps you'll agree with that statement. Perhaps you'll agree with me that by and large, it's not a positive experience. However, it should be, and that's something that we're working hard to try to change. It should improve your paper as a byproduct of the overall process, policing the quality of content appearing in international journals. Peer review also then advances your field. It advances research overall. And if you get the chance to get involved, something that we'll talk about at the end of this session, if you get the chance to participate in peer review, perform a peer review for a journal, you probably should take advantage of that because it will help you to improve your writing skills, your critical thinking skills, and may also help you to enhance your career. Now, fundamentally, as we get going, as we start to begin our discussion this afternoon, this evening, peer-reviewed papers are thought to be reliable because they have undergone this process before publication. As we've mentioned before, this is how international journals, scholarly journals that are listed in international databases maintain their quality. So getting started with your submission process, you're ready to send your paper off to a journal, make that initial submission. As we talked about before, one of the earliest parts of the peer review process is your cover letter that goes with your submission to a journal. You've got to have an effective cover letter. As an author, you want to get into your cover letter some peer review suggestions, some suggestions for colleagues who could review your paper. So this is one of the first sections of your paper that an editor's going to read. Make it count. Think about your cover letter when making a journal submission, when sending your next article off to an international journal. Why is the topic important? What is the key result? Why is your work an advance on previous work? Why are you submitting to this journal? And don't forget to provide peer review suggestions. As we talked about before, this is the first stage of the process, the first part of the research cycle in which you, an author, have the opportunity to engage with peer review, providing your suggestions to the journal, colleagues who would be suitable to make a review of your work. And you may remember this slide from our previous session as well, the old academic publishing cycle, the old academic publishing hamster wheel. As we go around and around and around this wheel, we end up as authors after journal selection, after article writing, after submission, in that peer review process, in that peer review stage of the publishing cycle. Understanding the peer review process helps authors, helps you as a researcher to be more successful with your submissions. So, thinking about peer review, obviously, the process by which international scholarly journals quality control their content, they are going to send your paper out as part of that process to a number of experts, a number of international colleagues, a number of other researchers working in your field or close to your field in order to check your paper and assess its suitability for publication in that journal. Different journals have different benchmarks. Different journals have different guidelines for peer reviewers. We'll talk about those in a minute. But journals around the world tend to use one of three main kinds of peer review. Completely open, where your identity as the author and the reviewer's identity is known to everybody. So-called one-side blinded peer review, the most common kind, most journals use this. That's where your identity is shown to the reviewer, but you as an author don't know the identity of the peer reviewers. One-side blinded. That's the most common kind. If you've sent a paper to an international journal, chances are you've probably gone through single blind or one-side blinded peer review. There's another form though called double blind, and that of course is where your identity and the peer reviewer's identity are kept from one another. The only person in the process who knows who everybody is the good old journal editor. And increasingly, journals are offering authors that option as well. We'll talk about it in a moment, but these are the three main kinds of peer review that different international journals use. Completely open, one-side blind, or double blind. If you've been through the process yourself, probably you've been through the one-side blind process. So here's a bit of a summary of that all over again. There are other forms of peer review as well. One of the most common additional kinds that you may also have come across in your research career so far is transferable peer review. That's where comments from one set of peer reviews get transferred over to another journal once the paper, if the paper gets rejected. If your paper gets rejected, maybe you'll be asked by that journal to transfer those comments over to another journal within the same family. So for example, Nature Publishing Group has a manuscript transfer system. If you send a paper to Nature and it gets rejected, but the comments are good, you feel the comments are valuable, you can have those comments transferred to another journal, Nature Communications, Nature Genetics, for example, and the editors at that second journal will use the peer review comments from the first set of reviews. So blind, double blind, completely open, completely transparent. Preprint servers, for example, are a good case in point for the use of transparent peer review, and transferable. And peer reviewers are going to be asked to look at your paper from a number of perspectives. The hypothesis, the appropriate methodology, is there good data analysis, is the data complete, and are the conclusions valid? So these are the kinds of things that peer reviewers will be asked to look at when your paper goes to a journal. These are the kinds of things that you should keep in mind as a researcher when putting your paper together, because peer reviewers are going to look at them. You need to make sure that you've got those pieces in your paper. And the most important one of these is the methodology point, because this is the area of academic writing and publishing where there are often issues in peer review. Editors and peer reviewers very often come back with comments about the method section. As we talked about last week, you need to have a watertight, a robust method section to have the best chance of surviving the peer review process. So just to kind of build on that a little bit, it's very interesting to note, if you have a look at the table on the right-hand side of this slide, double-blind peer review versus single-blind peer review. It's data published by Nature Communications based on a large survey of authors who were offered the option of either single-blind peer review or double-blind peer review. In some countries, more authors opted for blinded, double-blinded peer review. In this survey, China and India came out on top. These countries, more researchers wanted them, their papers to be double-blind peer reviewed. They wanted to remain anonymous from the peer reviewers. Why that is, I couldn't say, but the authors on average in these countries felt that that was a fairer approach for their papers. We know that bias exists in peer review. We saw from the Publons survey that I showed at the start that at least in 2018, about 30% of peer reviews were carried out by colleagues in the United States. So potentially some countries may feel a little bit biased against if that is the case. I don't know how you feel, but that is a fact, at least based on that survey data. So a quick summary of the different peer review models that different journals use. You can see them here, a slide that I took from PLOS, Public Library of Science, one of the big open access journal families. Very important for you as a researcher to be aware of the different kinds of peer review that are available to you so that you can select a journal that you feel fits best with how you want your paper to be assessed. A journal that uses double-blind peer review, you might feel is a better option for your research than a journal, for example, that's using transparent, completely open peer review. Be aware to make sure that you have the best chance of successfully publishing your research. Now, as we've talked about before, the colleagues, the researchers, the international experts who will be asked to evaluate your paper as part of the peer review process will be currently working in the same field or will have recently published a similar paper to the one that you are putting into the journal peer review system. And most often, these colleagues, these peer reviewers, are selected by the editor using an online system, or they come from your suggestions. Not always, and different journals, different publishers have different rules on whether author-selected peer reviewers can be used by editors, but it's always worth putting the names of some suitable colleagues into your cover letter in case. You're not losing anything by doing that. Indeed, if the editor chooses to use one of your suggestions, then you're ahead of the curve. And peer reviewers are going to be asked to critically comment on articles from an academic perspective, from a scientific perspective. What are the issues? Where are improvements needed? Potentially in the method section, as we've talked about before. Peer reviewers are always told, do not comment on the language. Do not comment on the English, but they often do. In fact, this is the #1 comment other than the method section that comes back to editors after peer review. So another reason why it's important to have a listen back to our second session, have a think about how you might improve your English language writing and communication before sending your paper off to a journal, because even though peer reviewers are asked not to comment on the language, send it back to the journal and get the journal to send the paper back to the authors for language editing if you think there's a language issue. Often the peer reviewers go ahead and do lots of editing work and they make lots of comments about the language. So we can help. Get in touch with me if you need help with your English language editing. It's important to have the text, the language, the English up to speed before making a submission. So that's a little bit of information about who peer reviewers are. Experts in the field. Usually 2 or 3 sets of comments will be made on your paper before the editor makes a decision. And also keep in mind that a view, comments about your paper, will be communicated by the peer reviewers to the editor, And then the editor decides how many of those comments, which of those comments to pass on to you, the author. So this is important because the decision that you get from a journal after peer review is often not all of the comments that a peer reviewer has made about your paper to a journal. Very often reviewers make comments to the editor that you will never know about. These comments inform decisions to a significant extent. So keep that in mind when reading the comments that you've gotten to see about your paper from the peer review process. There will be other comments that those peer reviewers have made directly to the editor that you will not get to see. So this helps you to balance your responses. It helps you to make decisions about whether to continue with submissions or not. Because peer reviewers are asked to evaluate both the study and the manuscript. And by the manuscript, I don't mean the language. We talked about that already. I mean the structure, whether or not the paper makes sense, whether or not all the different bits of the study are in the right places. Is the manuscript well put together? Is the argument convincing? Is the logic coherent? Is the hypothesis well tested? And they'll also be asked to evaluate the study, the methods, the results, the analysis. So these are the key things that peer reviewers will look at when they're asked to put your paper under the microscope, when they're asked to have a look at your paper as part of the peer review process. Relevancy of hypotheses, appropriate methodology, good data analysis, complete data, and valid conclusions. And this is a great slide to take a screenshot of, a great slide to save for your own work, because when you put your next paper together and send it to a journal, or think about sending it to a journal, Have you ticked all of these boxes with your work? Have you put these pieces of information into your cover letter? Have you really advanced the field? Have you really identified a knowledge gap? And so on. Are your analyses appropriate? Are your methodologies up to date? Do you have proper controls? And are your conclusions valid? Lots of journals give peer reviewers checklists that look a little bit like this. So it's worth keeping that in mind. So as an author, you are going to get through the peer review process by enhancing your article's chances of acceptance. By responding effectively to the comments that you get, you will increase your article's chances of acceptance. As a reviewer, if you are the one doing the peer review, then you are going to, I hope, comment constructively on the work of others. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But doing peer review, performing peer review, talking about the work, commenting on the work of other researchers constructively is actually a really key transferable skill. So something that you can develop as part of your career progression, your career development, as well as a researcher. So you've got different perspectives on the peer review process as an author and also as a reviewer. And then when comments come back to you on your work from the peer review process, there are a number of key things that you can do to enhance your article's chances of acceptance by providing a comprehensive, polite, well-argued, well-reasoned response to those peer review comments. Now, I recommend starting off a response document that will be comprehensive about the remarks that you have, about the comments that are made about your paper, with an editorial summary at the top. We would like to thank the 2 peer reviewers who worked on our paper for their considerable efforts and for the time they devoted to our work. Make the reviewers feel good. Tell them, thank them. They did devote considerable efforts. They're going to read this and they're going to think, yeah, I did devote considerable time. I did put in considerable effort. At least the authors appreciate that. It's polite, it's well argued, it's well put together, and you can then separate out the comments that are made about your paper and put your responses to those comments perhaps in a different color, in a different font, to make it clear to the editor what you did and how you changed your paper in response to those comments that you got in peer review. And do all of the comments that you get, even the small ones, because that shows that you are taking the process seriously. You are doing a comprehensive job. You're taking the process seriously. Far too many authors write back to journals and just say, thank you for the peer review comments. I've made all the changes requested. Here's my revision. And that's no use at all to an editor because they can't see what you've done. They can't make a judgment on whether you really have made all of the comments changes or not. Make the editor's job easier. Make your response document comprehensive. Answer all of the comments, even the small ones. As you can see in this example here, the reviewer is asking for American English. Thank you for this editorial comment. We have corrected our paper throughout. The editor will see this. The peer reviewer will probably see this and they'll think, they made the changes. Good job. I have a positive attitude towards this paper. I am probably going to give it a favorable response in second review. So tips and tricks for responding to reviewers' comments, you are going to be comprehensive. Show your editor you take the process seriously and think about the wording of the email that comes back from the journal with comments in it, because these aren't emails that editors sit down and write themselves. You know, these are automatically generated by a manuscript handling system, Scholar One, Editorial Manager, for example. So if you get minor comments on your paper, that means that the paper is probably not it's probably not going to go back to the peer reviewers again. Minor comments. If you get major comments, and that will be in the wording of the email that you receive, minor versus major or comprehensive changes required. If you get the second one, major comments requested, then probably the journal is at least going to give the peer reviewers of your first submission the chance to look at your paper again. So the wording and what you put into your commentary, your response to reviews, will be different. If you know that only the editor's going to see what you write, then you don't have to necessarily say as much about some of the comments that the reviewers have made. So look at the wording of your response emails from journals. If you have questions, of course, you can get in touch with me, but you should be comprehensive, be polite, and make as many changes to your paper as you can and put that information into your response document. We would like to thank the reviewer for his interest in the topic. The reviewer has correctly pointed out. We acknowledge, we concur. Thank you for the valuable comments. This valuable insight is much appreciated. These comments significantly enhance the quality of my work, are good ways, positive ways to respond to peer review comments. Peer reviewers see these and they think, yeah, I did make a valuable comment. Yeah, I did put considerable time into working on this paper. If you put your peer reviewer in a good mood, they will more likely click the accept button on your paper when it goes back to them in the second round. Lots of authors, though, say things like, I do not think the reviewers understand my point. It would not necessary to be changing according to the reviewer's suggestions. We simply do not have data. Repeating the analyses would not actually change our conclusions. A lot of this is in how you word your responses to journals to increase your chances of success. And of course, journals know this as well. And this is one reason why journals like, or increasingly like, blinded peer review, because they want to get more honest comments from peer reviewers. So of course, if the peer reviewer knows that their identity is not going to be revealed to the author, then they feel that they can be more honest. Whereas at the same time, this anonymous process can be open to abuse. As you probably know, too much power often is placed in the hands of peer reviewers. The editor has to adjudicate between different sets of comments. So what can we do as authors? Well, we can check the kinds of peer review that our target journals are using. We can choose the kind of peer review that works best for us, single blind, double blind, or completely open, completely transparent. And if you are a fan of transparency in peer review and open science, why not have a look at using a preprint server for your initial submission? If you make a submission to a double-blinded journal, make sure that you really do anonymize your paper, though, because we get lots of submissions that are going into the double-blind process where authors still say, as we previously showed, and then cite themselves. And that's, of course, a dead giveaway to the peer reviewer as to who you are. So make sure you anonymize your Word document, your PDF. Make sure it doesn't have your name in the track changes box. Anonymize place names, regions, nationalities, and submit a title page and an acknowledgements as a separate file to the journal, because that will make sure that you really are anonymous in the submission process. So if your journal uses double blind, turn off the track changes in Word, remove any author identification marks, and cite your own work anonymously, because you don't want people to know who you are if you're going into a double-blind process. Also, be aware of problematic requests from peer reviewers. If you get a problematic request from a peer reviewer as part of the process, flag it to the editor. Write to the editor and tell them. You should not be asked to add citations to a paper written by a peer reviewer. You should not be asked to make changes to your paper to more favorably reflect somebody else's earlier work. And you should not be asked to remove or modify hypotheses just to make a reviewer happy. If any of these things happen, it's reviewer bias. A reviewer is abusing their position, especially with the add my citations and I'll accept the paper one. Make sure you write to the editor. It's important to communicate with editors. They are there to police the peer review process. Bias happens, of course, absolutely. Here's an example of a paper that I was an author on. It got rejected 3 times, authors in Hungary and Romania, until we added an author from the University of Manchester in the UK. And of course, the paper then got accepted when we sent it back again. So people look at your country of origin. People look at your university. They make decisions about the quality of the work based on those incorrect assumptions. But it's important to be aware of these kinds of bias that may exist in the peer review process. Human nature, byline bias, institutional bias, and so on. It's part of the scientific process, but is it fair? Of course not. So you may want to go for a double-blind peer review. Selecting journals that use this process, make sure to remove all author identification marks from your document. We've got lots of checklists. We've got lots of information that you can use to help you with the process. Now, what's happening though, if you've sent a paper to peer review, or you've sent a paper to a journal and it's gone out for peer review, but you haven't heard back? What should I do? How long should I wait? The average time from submission to online publication is 90 days. 90 days. So you must write to the editor at your journal if your paper is in process with a journal for more than 6 to 8 weeks. Write, but be positive. Give something back to the editor. We see that our paper is still awaiting reviews. Please, can we make some suggestions to speed up the process? Is there anything we can do to help with the process? Here are some suggestions for additional peer reviewers that you might like to contact. Give something back to editors when you write to them, and be polite and positive. But very important to keep in mind this statistic, 90 days. If your paper is in a journal submission system for more than 6 to 8 weeks, now it's time to write and ask for an update. Here are some stats. Incredibly, have a look at the numbers of authors in this survey from Nature in 2016 who waited more than 2 years, 3 years, more than 5 years for their paper to come out. It's incredible. You should not be in this position. You should be writing to editors. Why might there be a delay? Well, it takes time to find peer reviewers. Reviewers might be slow. Reviewers might not accept to review your paper. Don't forget that Publon survey that we showed at the start. 2 out of every 3 requests for peer review are turned down by journals, or indeed the editor might just have forgotten. They're an academic, potentially working at a university. They might just have forgotten to process your paper. So wait 6 to 8 weeks, write a polite email, make additional suggestions. Here is a template. We will give you this at the end of the session for writing to ask for information about your paper. I'm writing in regard to my article. Give the number. Help the editor to find your paper in their online system. Provide additional suggestions for peer reviewers. Stay confident. It's very important to be confident. You can always appeal peer review decisions. Not a lot of authors do it, but you should always do this. If your paper gets rejected, but you feel unfairly treated, write to the editor. Explain why. Suggest another set of peer review comments. Suggest another round of peer review. What's the worst that can happen? Well, the worst that can happen is your paper stays rejected. So it's always, 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 always worth writing to editors and querying their decisions if you feel unfairly treated. It's happened to me on a number of occasions. I have several examples of high-profile papers that got published. Nature Communications initially rejected. We felt that those decisions were unfair, so we wrote to the editor and asked for another round. We gave reasons why we felt unfairly treated. We talked about the issues with the peer review, why they were incorrect. The editor changed their mind. But you've got to communicate. You've got to write to editors to give them that opportunity. Check your rejection letters, because often journals actually do want you to resubmit. If they reject the paper, they often want a resubmission. We cannot publish, does not contain, will not further consider, publish elsewhere are red flags, no point resubmitting. But if the journal letter says the reviewer comments are not entirely negative, we cannot publish your paper in its current form, might be helpful to revise your manuscript in the future. I regret the outcome has not been favorable at this time. These are flags for you to think, should I resubmit? Write to the editor and ask. The comments we got led to a rejection, but we feel we can answer them all in a revised paper. Can we resubmit to your journal? If they want, they will say yes. And often this is actually what they want you to do, because journals like to keep their rejection rates up. Make sure you're polite. Make sure you keep it polite at all times. I have some actual examples of emails from authors that are good. Thank you so much for considering my manuscript. And thanks to the reviewers for their valuable and constructive comments. If you give me the chance to make the revisions to my manuscript, I will consider and I will fully satisfy them. Concerning reviewer 3, I have to express my reasons and evidence. That's a good email. Here's a bad one. I give up. The referees can calm down. I get the impression they will just come up with another whinge to delay or frustrate. So maybe just forget that I submitted the paper and I'll find somewhere else with more open-minded referees who don't hide behind anonymity. These are real emails. Remember, your editor is handling lots of papers. They're clicking buttons in an online system. Don't take their comments personally, but you can always ask them if you can make a resubmission. Very important. As authors, check which kinds of peer review your journal is using. Choose a kind of peer review that works best for you, and consider open peer review potentially as a fair kind of peer review process. Here's a template as well. We'll give you these at the end for sending back comments in revision after you get your papers back from peer review. There are standard forms that we can give you to help follow up on this. And from an editor's perspective, keep in mind that they are struggling to find peer reviewers. They're often finding it difficult to find enough people to evaluate papers. Here's some other real emails. When I wrote to ask a reviewer to follow up, where's the peer review? I'm writing to follow up to ask about your review. We appreciate your time, but it's now 6 weeks overdue. Have a look at the emails I got back from that peer reviewer. It's difficult for editors as well. And that's why journals often invite more than 4 colleagues to review each paper so that they have enough reviews at the end of the process. I put together a little list of different kinds of peer reviewers that we won't go through in detail now, but there really are 7 different kinds of individuals who write reviews: cursory, aggressive, thoughtful, jealous, late, angry, and invisible. I call them the 7 dwarfs of peer review. If you are asked by a journal to provide a peer review for them, please be thoughtful. Please provide thoughtful comments, in-depth comments, and constructive remarks that enable an author to improve their work. I know it's human nature. If you see a paper, your immediate thought is often, how can I find the issues with this paper? But please try to be positive. Please try to conduct a fair and balanced assessment of another colleague's work. You are being asked to assess suitability of this paper for publication in a particular journal. Commenting constructively on the work of others is a key transferable skill. We are here to help you maximize your success. If you have any questions, you can just ask us. We have talked today about peer review, its different forms, how to manage the process as an author, good and bad communication, tips and tricks.